Thank you. Okay, I will begin by introducing myself and then I'll run you through the session. I'm Sakshi Balani. I'm the director for our India work and director of policy at Climate Catalyst. We work in 3 geographies, but the relevant geography for today is India. We run a steel decarbonisation program here and run the India Green Steel Network. And it is my absolute pleasure to be seeing all of you joining this very important session on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So let me just begin with a why. So why are we doing this? A bunch of us met at a global CSO convening held in Milan in May. And we had a small group of us running networks on steel decarbonization across multiple geographies. And we all kind of echoed a need for a capacity building session for the global community on CSOs, on CBAM, a kind of a 101 session that provides the essentials or the basics of CBAM. And we're hoping that that's very much true. Let me just introduce the other organizers for the day. And if each organizer can just give a quick wave so you all can meet them as well. There's Amanda from WWF Finland, representing the WWF network. She's the global lead for steel decarbonization there. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, everyone.
There's Carlotta. And I guess there's Mark somewhere, but Carlotta from Beyond Fossil Fuels, who runs the European Fossil-Free Steel Network. It's a mouthful, does power packed work. We also have Buket joining from European Climate Foundation. She must be a familiar face for many of you. And we have Kinshu joining from the India Green Steel Network, my own personal hero running the network here in India. Just before we kick off, I wanted to just give a big thank you to all of these organizers who have spent a lot of time collaborating with each other, as well as me, and over the past few months. So without them, we would not have been able to pull this off. So I really appreciate all the effort that's gone into it. Now, the agenda for the day is basically going to cover a few things, right? So the first is, what is CBAM and why does it matter? I'm sure all of you know what it is, but we're going to give you a little bit more than what it is. We're going to explain the rationale for it, how it works, the direct and the indirect impacts on the market. And then we go into the implications of CBAM on exporting markets using India as a case study. We will have significant time for Q&A and then some closing remarks and next steps, right? Now, before I introduce the speakers, could I please run through a couple of points of hygiene or logistics? One, there will be a short break after the first speaker, and there will be ample time for Q&A in the middle of the first speaker's presentation if there is time, but also 5 minutes after the first speaker, and then anywhere between 20 to 40 minutes for the final Q&A. So you will have time. But if you have questions as you're listening to a speaker's remarks, please put them in the chat and the moderators will find time to direct them to the speakers as and when we can. We haven't permitted AI note takers. We'd love to just have humans on the call today, and that might be a little bit of fun. We're going to ask you all to keep yourselves muted until we ask you to come off the Q&A. Yeah. Thank you so much for complying with this. It just helps for easy running of the entire session. All right. So let me just introduce our first speaker for the day. Our speaker is Constantin Johnson, who's a CBAM expert and researcher. Constantin, you can wave a hi whenever you feel like it. Constantin holds an MSc in engineering from the Lund University, specializing in steel decarbonization and climate policy analysis. In addition to academic research, he has professional experience of working with CBAM in industry as well as civil society. And his work on CBAM has ranged from modeling global market impacts to addressing detailed implementation issues within the European Commission expert group for a well-functioning and fair CBAM. I can't think of anybody else to kind of introduce the session. So let me just hand it over to you. Constantin, over to you.
Thank you, Sachi. And also thank you to all other organizers for getting this together. So let me just share my screen. And okay, can we all see my screen? Any thumbs up? We have thumbs up. Great. Right, so let me see how this. Okay, so the aim for today, which Sakshi very well explained, is to sort of give the basics and the key essentials of the functions of the CBAM, and the agenda looks a bit like this. So first we're going to talk about why the EU implements a CBAM. Then we're going to talk about how does the EU CBAM work. And then we're going to use that understanding to figure out how is it going to affect the market. And then lastly, we're briefly going to discuss some indirect effects as well. So let's start with why the EU implements a CBAM, and I'm going to speak for about an hour. So bear with me. We're going to start from the very beginning, which is that green steel is more expensive than conventional steel. So that means there's the so-called marginal abatement cost, which is the difference between the two, and that has to be covered somehow. And we're just going to take an arbitrary country as an example. So let's say this is country A. And traditionally, the idea is to introduce a carbon price. And now the conventional steel is as expensive or preferably more expensive than green steel. And now we will have our investments in green steel and everything's good. Problem solved, right? Well, it's not quite that easy, because there's also country B, which also produces steel. So why is that a problem for country A? Well, steel is a heavily traded commodity and therefore very price sensitive. So even a very small, like 10, 20 euro difference has quite some impact on the market. And steel prices vary across countries. So if we just raise the steel price in one country, companies would import steel from other countries where it's cheaper. So no one would invest in green steel in country A because the BF from country B is cheaper. But that's not the end of the story, though, because if the emission intensity of the steel in country B is higher than that in country A, we've not only bankrupted the steel production in country A, but we've also increased the emissions globally. And this phenomenon has a name, and it's called carbon leakage. Okay, so if all countries have the same carbon price, where are we? If all countries have the same carbon price, the price of steel would increase in an equivalent manner in every country. Okay, perfect. So, and then we wouldn't have this problem. If country B introduces the same carbon price as in country A, the BF steel in country B is no longer cheaper than in country A. But unfortunately, climate ambition and carbon prices vary across countries, while most countries don't have any carbon price. So how can country A solve this problem? Well, country A can introduce something called a border carbon adjustment, or BCA, which puts a carbon price at the border where the product enters the country. So now from the point of view of country A, if you're in country A and you look out to the rest of the world, all steel from your point of view now has a carbon price. And the result of that is that country A has now created a safe space for decarbonization, where country A can have a carbon price, and the more expensive green steel now achieves competitiveness. So for many countries, not all countries, but many countries where this situation applies, where the cost of green steel is much higher than the conventional BF, and the carbon price must take the difference, a BCA becomes a necessity. And so in a way, it's an inevitable consequence of decarbonization itself. And some countries will be able to solve this problem in other ways, but for many countries, there's no alternative. And in those countries, the BCA must happen. There's no option. So there's a price difference and it has to be corrected. And the concept of BCAs have existed in the academic literature for several decades. So there's really nothing new about it in that sense. So now that we've discussed this at a general level, we can make the situation a bit more context dependent. So let's call country A the EU and country B all other countries. And this BCA we call the CBAM. So here we are. This is what we have. And as I said, the idea of BCAs has existed for a long time. So what's new here is that the EU is the first to actually implement a BCA, and they call it CBAM. And they just changed places of the B and C because CBAM, of course, sounds better than BSAM. And what's tricky here is that there are many different ways to implement a BCA. So everyone that implements a BCA might do it slightly differently. And so what products does it cover? How does it cover the products and so on? And today we'll talk about the sort of the key concepts of how the EU has implemented the CBAM. And as we say, we're covering the basics today, but if you have more detailed questions, please do ask them in the Q&A. So now we're ready for the next chapter, which is how does it work? And more importantly, why now? So why is this happening now? The carbon pricing instrument in the EU is a so-called emissions trading system, or ETS, and the EU ETS has been around for about 20 years. So we should have had green steel long time ago. So why don't we have any green steel? So why we should have had green steel long time ago? Why don't we have any green steel? It's because of something called free allocation. And free allocation is very important in this context. An emissions trading system works like this. To make an example, it's a bit like buying shares of a stock of a company. So you buy a share and there are a certain number of shares, which here refer to so-called emission allowances. Okay, and one allowance corresponds to 1 ton of CO2. And just like with the stock, the price of the share or allowance is determined by how many shares or allowances there are, and the demand, which is how many emissions there are. So how many allowances are needed? If there are a lot of emissions that have to be covered, but there are not that many allowances, then the price for one allowance is high. Like this linear relationship here. So if I'm a steel producer and I emit X tons of CO2, I need to buy X many emission allowances. Well, at least that's how it should be, but it's not, and that's the thing. Because some of these allowances are given for free, and that's what we call free allocation. So if I have X emissions and Y free allowances, I only pay for this Z here, for this difference. But the steel sector in the EU currently has full free allocation. So all emissions from steel production are for free. And this is one of the key reasons why we don't yet have any green steel in the EU, even though we've had the ETS for 20 years, because there's no real carbon cost. So in fact, historically, there have been more free allowances than emissions. So steel producers have actually been overcompensated by this. But this is all going to change because starting next year in 2026, free allocation will be removed or phased out. So that means removed piece by piece over time until it's zero from 2026 to 2034. So year by year, the carbon cost, or Z, will increase. But wait a second, then we have this situation I spoke about earlier, that if we just increase the cost in one country, then they just import from another country and we have carbon leakage. So while the free allocation is phased out, the CBAM will be phased in. So the carbon cost increase in the EU will correspond to the carbon cost increase for products coming into the EU. The phase out and phase in curves look like this. And when you hear the CBAM factor, this is it. So the blue line there is the CBAM factor. And if you think this is somewhat a strange looking curve, then you would be right, I think. So now with the phase out of free allocation, if emissions are higher than what is covered by free allocation Y, carbon cost Z is paid. And the same for imports. And in another scenario, if emissions are lower or equal than corresponding free allocation, then ETS and CBAM cost is 0. And so this is what provides the incentive for decarbonization. So the lower the emissions, the lower the cost. And this is also why the CBAM is inherently different from a tariff or a normal tax, because first, EU producers pay the same through the EU ETS. And second, you can avoid paying CBAM at all by simply having less emissions. So it's very different from a tariff. And so the CBAM is really a climate policy. It's not a trade policy. It's a climate policy, but it will have an effect on trade nonetheless. And we'll go through that in a bit. And to clarify one important thing here, so free allocation can only be phased out if there's a CBAM. So there can only be a carbon cost in the EU if there's a CBAM. And as I explained before with country A and country B, so the CBAM is a precondition for the phase out of free allocation. Okay, so if you're a steel producer in Europe with or elsewhere with a lot of emissions, then you want as much free allocation or as little CBAM as possible. So for you, it would be somewhat strategic to attack the CBAM, to try to make it go away, because then there would be no carbon cost. So if you've heard a lot of criticism about the CBAM that says it's not effective, or it has this problem or that problem, 9 out of 10 times the criticism isn't really real, and they just don't want to pay for their emissions. Now there are some real problems with the CBAM as well, but quite small problems, which can all be fixed quite easily. And the reason for that is it's the first time the world has a CBAM. So everything's not going to be perfect from the beginning, but at least we know from the data that we have that it's good enough. So there's no cause for alarm. In fact, you could argue that this has somewhat been planned all along, because we're currently in what's called the transitional period. So what does that mean? It's like a test phase. So from 2023 to end of this year, companies have been obliged to report. So measuring their emissions, doing the calculations, submitting the reports, but without paying an actual cost to figure out what's working and what's not working. So it's all part of the plan. And what does that mean for where we are right now and what's coming in terms of the legislation? So this is what the legislation looks like. It's like a tree. So at the top, we have the ETS directive, and the CBAM regulation follows from that. And the CBAM regulation is the main legislation for the CBAM. And then there are also so-called implementing and delegated acts. So the CBAM regulation determines the scope of the CBAM, like what does it apply to, what products, and the acts determine how it applies. So for example, how emissions are supposed to be calculated, or how the CBAM cost is paid. Now, speaking of how to calculate the CBAM cost, how does that work? Well, We don't know exactly because it hasn't been decided yet. It's an implementing act that will be determined now in Q4, so this year still. Okay, so we don't know, but just thinking, what could it be? Which is really the same question as asking, what is the phase-in? Okay, so what is it that is being phased in? So we can start reasoning from there that the CBAM cost, or the CBAM shall apply cost equivalent to what they would pay if it was produced in the EU. And we know what EU producers pay through the ETS, because that legislation we have. So we don't have the CBAM legislation, but we have the EU ETS legislation, and we say it has to be equivalent, so we can figure out the CBAM from the ETS. And in the EU, the ETS prices emissions like this. So we have our emissions, and then we deduct the free allocation, which is the mass of the product you produce. So how much we produce, like iron ore pellets or iron or steel, times the ETS product benchmark, which is a technical ETS thing, but basically that's how much free allocation you get per ton of product you produce. And then times the CBAM factor. So this graph I showed earlier. So if we now adopt the principle of equivalent pricing, the CBAM should work the same. And of course, if the emissions are less than the corresponding free allocation, then costs are zero. They're not negative, they're zero. Okay, so the EU will not pay other countries to import. Okay, so that's a key difference here. But another key piece of the CBAM is the countries can deduct a cost if they have a domestic carbon price. So let's say that China has a carbon price on steel production, then they can deduct it from the CBAM. Yeah, so you don't have to pay for the same emissions twice. So instead, they pay for the difference in carbon price. And if you want to make your voice heard on these topics, there are currently 3 public consultations open until the 25th of September, so this month, still a couple of days, for these implementing and delegated acts that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so one which determines this pricing mechanism that I showed, which is how are we gonna adjust the CBAM for free allocation? And number 2 is how to calculate the embedded emissions. So the actual methodology for how do we count the emissions. And 3, rules for deducting carbon price paid in another country. So what are the rules? So can you just offset emissions and then have it deducted by the CBAM, or like how strict does it have to be, and system boundaries and so on? And you can find more information about this on the Commission website. Okay, so with this pricing mechanism, we've now created a level playing field. Imports pay as much as EU producers. And this is quite a critical point because of fair trade and something called WTO, which is the World Trade Organization. Okay, and you can think about this as like international law on trade. And I'm just going to cover this very, very briefly because I'm not a lawyer. But basically, you can think that if the pricing is equivalent on both sides of the border, then it's fair trade. And if countries outside the EU pay more than what they would have paid in the EU, then it's not fair trade, or it's not WTO compatible, is what we say. But if we want to get really technical here, then it's not possible to say if something is WTO compatible or not until a WTO court has tried the case and made a decision. So just like any other legislation in any country, innocent until proven guilty. And in fact, this imposes quite an interesting constraint on the CBAM, which is that the CBAM can never be stronger than the EU ETS. So at most, it can be equal. That's the maximum. So that is, the CBAM can at most charge as much as the EU ETS if the product would have been produced in the EU. Well, that's a rather complicated sentence. And why am I saying it's so complicated? And why am I saying equivalent pricing and not equal pricing? So let's think about that. So we have the situation again, and with what we just learned about this pricing mechanism, we can now understand these carbon costs a bit better. So with the phase out of free allocation and the phase in of the CBAM, we get equivalent costs in the EU and on steel from outside the EU. Equivalent cost. So the net competitiveness is unchanged. And therefore, the CBAM should have no effect on trade. Correct? No. Well, why not? Well, as we learned when we talked about the pricing mechanism, the carbon cost has to do with emissions. And in fact, these costs are only equal if the emission intensities of both are equal. So if both the EU production and the production in another country is, say, 1.8 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, now carbon costs are equal, as we see here. But if the other country has a higher emission intensity, say 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel instead of 1.8, now the carbon costs are higher than in the EU, because if it would have been produced in the EU, they would have paid for the 2 tons. But on the other hand, if the emission intensity is lower than what is given free allocation, then CBAM costs are 0. So it's equivalent pricing, not equal pricing. And what would the cost be if it would have been produced in the EU? And this is an important thing to understand when we try to figure out how the CBAM will impact the steel market, because it's all about this. And so let's talk about that right now. Because of course, there's not only the EU and country B, there's also country C and D, and many, many more. And people forget that there's not only competition with European producers, so country B does not only compete with European producers, but all other countries, of course, also compete against each other to keep their market share of exports to the EU. So if before the CBAM production costs were like this, as you can see here, and country B is the cheapest, but now with the CBAM, because different countries have different emission intensities, all of a sudden, country C is the cheapest, and country D is now above the marginal market price and has lost its exports. Okay, it's no longer competitive. But it does not end here. In fact, this is where things start to become really interesting, because now country D says, hey, I want to keep my exports, so I will reduce my emissions to get a lower CBAM cost. So now the EU sets the marginal market price. So the EU also reduces its emissions, but now country B is not competitive anymore. So now they reduce their emissions, and then C, and then D, and then so on, until everything is green. Yeah. And so this is how the ETS and the CBAM together incentivize decarbonization. And it's all about this together. So, and in fact, the change in competition that we get from the CBAM, you can't talk about the CBAM alone, because the change in competition is the difference between the EU ETS and the CBAM. So we can't really understand the effect the CBAM will have by analyzing the CBAM alone without understanding the EU ETS, because what moves the market is the difference in pricing, between these two instruments and between the two markets. So this is why we had to talk about the ETS before, okay? Makes sense now? And so now all pieces are starting to come together here. So it's both competition with EU producers who are also decarbonizing and changing the market price, and competition between all other countries to stay below this marginal market price, or the marginal cost. And you always want to remain below this marginal market price. So if you're above, then you're not competitive, and you've lost your production or your exports or what. So this is the economic market incentive to reduce emissions, to stay below the marginal curve. So the question is, how fast will this happen that I just showed? So how fast does everything go green? And if this happens fast enough, this could become like a decarbonization race. But at the moment, I'm not so sure we'll get that. If you would have asked me 1 year ago, I would have said maybe. But now a bit more unsure. It'll be that fast. But so how fast are these effects going to happen? And maybe is it possible for us to understand this in a bit more detail? We've talked about it now on a general level, but maybe there's more if we zoom in a little bit. So using economic theory and our understanding of the steel sector, the technological options for producing steel, and the economics behind it, we can start to figure out these main market trends. Okay, so we start off by making a simple assumption, which we have to do. And in fact, we've already made it in our analysis before, which is that the market price is equal to the production cost plus the CBAM or ETS cost, which is the same. And the CBAM price is the ETS price. So we disregard politics and security interests. And we're looking at this from a purely economical point of view. And that allows us to make some simple first conclusions that are going to help us along the way to understand these market effects a bit better. And piece by piece, and by the end, you're going to be able to use this logic to understand and figure out what this means for your specific country, okay? Because it's universal. So starting off, we know that low production costs are cheaper than high production costs. Lower costs are cheaper than higher costs. Makes sense. Okay. So, and we know that low CBAM costs are cheaper than high CBAM cost. Okay. Very trivial, very easy. So we now have a two-dimensional problem. So maybe you have a high production cost, but lower emissions, or you have a low production cost and high emissions. And it's about, so what the combinations between the two, because it's all about the total cost. But we also know that the cost of the emissions is proportional to the ETS price, because the CBAM price is the ETS price. And the higher the price, the higher the CBAM cost. And we know that the costs increase over time because the CBAM factor declines over time, and the CBAM cost therefore increases over time. And in fact, as I showed earlier, the CBAM factor is non-linear. It's this strange looking curve, and it's the only factor here that's non-linear. So the competitiveness will be determined the most by the CBAM factor out of all factors more than anything else, because all other things are only linear. Okay, so we now have a three-dimensional problem we have production cost, we have EU ETS price, and we have CBAM factor. And of course, what I didn't include here yet is the emission intensity of the steel production. So now we have 4 dimensions. And since the emission intensity is also correlated to the production cost, because green steel is more expensive than conventional steel, we know this. So that means these 2 dimensions are not independent from each other. And that's what makes understanding the CBAM market impact so difficult, because the competitiveness or the end result sort of is dependent on 4 different things. And 2 of those correlate to each other. And one of them is nonlinear. And the human brain can only think in 3 dimensions anyway. So that's why we're struggling to understand the very exact CBAM impact. So that's why we're starting off piece by piece. So we have to analyze, further isolate each dimension to understand how big each contribution is to the total cost. And to summarize, we can say that as time progresses,
Constantine, sorry to come in, but a recent question in the chat is actually related to your last slide. So I thought I'd jump in so that we can look at the slide while you answer.
This one?
This slide, yes. The question is, I'm not sure if I get how high production costs are related to high CBAM costs. I see this on the chart. Shouldn't be the opposite.
No, it's not. No, I don't think that's what it says. No, it's about the total cost. So it's about, so the marginal market price is set. So we made this assumption here, which is the market price is equal to production cost plus carbon cost, which is CBAM cost. Okay, so you can have, as I can say, so there are infinite number of combinations here. So you can have high production costs and low CBAM cost. You can also have high production cost and high CBAM cost. And when we try to figure out which countries are going to be competitive on the market, so there's a market price, you have to stay below the market price. It's about this total cost and the combinations, because you have a production cost, and so far on the market, you've only had a production cost. So far, the countries that are competitive on the market are those with low production costs. But now that you also have a CBAM cost, you could potentially still be competitive if you have a higher production cost and a lower CBAM cost. And that was really the first slide I showed. So if this is green steel and this is conventional steel, so now production costs are higher for green steel than for conventional steel, but you add the carbon cost. So now all of a sudden, so now the total cost is higher because of this carbon cost. And now the green steel is cheaper in total, and it's about the total. Is that sufficient?
I think
okay.
I think it was, yes.
Okay, great.
Go on.
I just muted myself, which would be a bad idea. So where was I? So so we have many things at once, or many different things that all sort of impact the total cost of steel. So, and as I said, it's very difficult for the human brain to understand all of these things at the same time. So we're going to look at each and every one and understand how big each contribution is to the total cost. And I think this slide sort of answers the question I received as well, which is, as you can see, the CBAM becomes a bigger part of the total steel cost. So if you have high emissions, so it's emission intensive production, classic BF-BOF. So therefore, the competitiveness of steel is increasingly more dependent on its emissions and less dependent on its production cost. Okay, and as I said, the CBAM factor is non-linear, but PowerPoint doesn't do non-linear, so we're gonna have to settle for this triangle here. It looks like a linear curve, but actually it's it's a bit of an exponential curve, and then it becomes linear in the end. So the competitiveness of steel is increasingly more dependent on its emissions and less dependent on its production costs. And that's why the ETS and the CBAM combined, they create this demand pull for green steel outside the EU. Okay, so we can make a simplified scale like this. So at first, high emission BF-BOF imports, which is what we have today, are substituted with lower emission BF-BOF imports, yeah, because it's about relative to EU emissions. Yeah, so if the EU is 1.8, then competitive would also be 1.8 or 1.7 or below 1.7. So at first, so as we go over time, so starting 2026 to 2034, high emission BF-BOF imports are substituted with lower emission BF-BOF and sort of higher emission scrap EAF, secondary steel imports, which are later substituted with HDRI EAF imports and low emission secondary steel imports. And if the ETS price is high, these changes happen sooner. And if the ETS price is low, they happen later. So in the beginning, so in the first few years with the CBAM, because all steel is not going to be green tomorrow or in January when the CBAM kicks in. So in the first few years where the CBAM cost is still too low for green steel to be profitable, yeah, so green steel, BF-BOF, small carbon cost, but not enough to close this gap here, the marginal abatement cost. So in the beginning, countries with lower emission BF-BOF will likely take market share from countries with higher emission BF-BOF. Okay, so what does this mean for all countries? Well, we've solved this emission problem, yeah, so we now understand those dynamics. But of course, costs for green steel varies across countries as well. Yeah, so again, total cost, production cost, plus carbon cost. We talked about the carbon cost now. So now we can start varying the production cost, and
Constantin?
that, yes?
Sorry, there's a clarification question in the chat about this slide. And what do you mean for secondary scrap or low emission scrap EAF? If you could clarify that before you turn to the next slide. Thanks.
Thank you. So scrap, so secondary steel is just a different name for scrap EAF. Okay, so that's what I meant by that, and what I mean by low emission. So all secondary steel, so all scrap EAF steel is not low emissions, because of course it very much depends on the emission intensity of electricity. So EAF, electric arc furnace, so the primary energy carrier is electricity. So the emission intensity is dependent on the emission intensity of electricity. So if you produce scrap EAF in a country where you have coal gasification-based electricity production, then your scrap EAF emissions are high. Okay. Now, of course, that's dependent on an eventual scope 2 inclusion of emissions in the CBAM. But some countries, so it's not only about electricity, but so there are different steel making recipes. Yeah, you can make steel in different ways, and some countries also use natural gas in this process, and other sort of carburization techniques. And if you've ever seen in EAF, it sort of goes both, and all the gases in the air. So it's quite hard to capture the emissions. So in some countries, so there's definitely a difference between higher emission scrap EAF and a difference between low emission scrap EAF. And as the CBAM cost increases, low emission scrap EAF will become increasingly competitive. That's the point. So these are main market trends, okay? And then dependent on the exact production cost, which varies in every country, and the exact ETS price we have for the exact year, it'll be competitive in maybe 1 year or the other year, depending on all of these factors. Okay. Moving on. So it's the combination of production cost and emission intensities that changes the relative advantages between countries. So as I said, today, the market is only production cost. Yeah, so we're looking at this from a purely economical point of view. We're not talking about resilience or security or quality or trade relationships, or does one politician like the other, and so on. Purely economical. Today is only production cost. The one that has the cheapest production cost wins. But with the CBAM, emission intensities also start to play a role, and more for each year. And so that changes the relative advantages between countries. Because since the places where green steel is cheap, yeah, so where is it cheap to produce green steel, which you eventually need to stay competitive with the CBAM, is not the same place or is not necessarily the same place where the industry is now. So the competitive landscape itself has changed. So the countries which are competitive with the EU today are not necessarily the countries which will be competitive in the future, because the countries that are competitive in the future are those that will have cheap green steel, and those are not necessarily the same countries as today. As we know from the sort of general literature on green steel techno-economic assessments, right? So renewable comparative advantages, renewable electricity prices, scrap prices, labor costs, etc. So I wanted to show you guys a couple of examples from my research, which will be published in about 2 weeks. And there you can read much more sort of specific details about specific country impact, but also in general on global steel decarbonization, because since you need green steel to be competitive eventually, we first had to solve this question of sort of who will have green steel, and then you can solve for who remains competitive with the CBAM. So it's sort of 2 papers in one paper. But here are some small graphs. I've sampled some interesting cases to use as examples here. And because this is not published yet, I'm unfortunately gonna have to do this, but we can still see the most important information. So let's talk about what we're looking at. So from left to right, the bars are BF-BOF, scrap EAF, and HDRI EAF costs for 2025. And then from 2026 and 2035, the production costs are the same, but the lines show the total cost. So that is the production cost that we have plus the CBAM cost. And this sort of shaded gray area, that's the EU BF-BOF. So that's where the market price is. Yeah, and so you can see how this varies over time. So as I said, we have these different dimensions, and the only one that we're changing here, because here we assume that emission intensities and production costs are constant, is the CBAM factor. So here you can see exactly how big of an impact that this one thing has, the CBAM factor. Okay, so starting from, if we look at this sort of dotted line here for China, so this is for an ETS price of 150 euros, and the solid line is 80. Okay, so we know the cost is gonna, we don't know the exact ETS price in the future, so we have a high limit and a lower limit, and we know the real costs are gonna be somewhere in between. Okay, and what we can see here is quite interesting, because so now I'm going to explain the sort of the combinations of production cost and emission intensities, what that does. So starting with China, it has a higher average emission intensity than the EU, yeah, but a much lower production cost for BF-BOF. Yeah, so I'm talking about BF-BOF, higher emission intensity than in the EU, but much lower production cost. So what we found is that BF-BOF, this dotted line here, is below the top of the shaded area, which is the EU. So what we found is that China BF-BOF will likely remain competitive, because the low production costs offset the slightly higher emission intensities. And what we also found is China also has good opportunities for green steel. So as you can see, the two costs sort of cross each other at around 2030. Now, taking India is a little different, because here, as in China, production costs are also much lower than in the EU, but emissions are much higher. So on average, country average. So we found it will not be competitive. So it's this dot, now the dotted lines are up here. And the only, so that will not be competitive. But India, of course, has also good opportunities for green steel through very good solar and also offshore wind. So we found they can stay competitive to invest in that. Yeah. So now we're starting to see how sort of the CBAM cost can start to affect investment decisions. Yeah. And now let's use a third case, which is Russia. Emissions are high, so BF-BOF is not competitive, but green steel costs are also high. So it's very difficult for Russia to sustain competitive exports with the CBAM. Yeah. So in China, we had the example BF-BOF competitive and green steel competitive. India, we had BF-BOF not competitive, but green steel competitive. And in Russia, we have BF-BOF not competitive and green steel not competitive. And the only so that's just to illustrate what the CBAM favors low emissions. Yeah, so you price emissions, lower emissions pay off, but then of course you also have the production costs for producing green steel that are differently high in different countries. Okay, and so that means, taking Russia as an example, that countries with a lower cost may outcompete Russia and take their export market share to the EU. So okay, maybe Russia is a bad example, but so what they export to the EU now, another country can outcompete Russia for these exports. Okay, and I must ask you not to share this. In about 2 weeks, it's all published much more, so you can have a good read. And but now I'm gonna make a little bit of a disclaimer and further complicate things a little bit, because the CBAM is not a country-to-country policy. It's a company-to-company policy. So what does that mean? So say that a European company, Mercedes, for example, wants to buy steel, and they can buy steel from any company, of course, but let's say they're gonna buy steel from a company from China. Now, how many steel companies are there in China, or in India, or in Brazil? Like a lot. And so because you have many different steel companies, you also have many different emission intensities. And therefore, the CBAM costs vary across producers in the same country. Okay, so before we made a simplification, we said we're talking about a country, and we say it's all the same. But in reality, of course, emission intensities differ between producers in the same country. So while one company has been exporting to the EU historically, maybe another company with lower emissions is more competitive now with the CBAM. So the CBAM doesn't only change the competitiveness between countries, but also between companies in the same country. And as we also know from the general green steel decarbonisation literature, that that competitive green steel is not necessarily in the same place where steel is produced now. Yeah, so that means the company maybe moves within a country or between countries. So, and these circumstances can certainly create some interesting politics in every country. So it could be that you have winners and losers in each country. Yeah, so it's not really, and we talk about countries most of the time to simplify the discussion, and we use country average emission intensities for our calculations, but in reality it's company to company. And in fact, it's the European company which pays for the CBAM and is legally responsible for complying with the legislation. Okay, so India or Mexico or Brazil does not pay for the CBAM. It's the European importer that pays for the CBAM. And I know, so this is there's been a lot of misinformation about this, that and if you don't believe me, you can just Google who pays for the CBAM and it's gonna say the European importer. So the CBAM doesn't like take any money from countries outside the EU, like in the traditional sense. And as I say, it's a common misunderstanding. But if the exports to the EU have high emissions and therefore a high CBAM cost, so I'm Mercedes and I want to import steel, maybe now for me it's cheaper to buy steel from a different company which has lower emissions because the CBAM favors low emissions, as does any carbon price that you can find anywhere in the world. Yeah, that's how any carbon price works. That's the point of a carbon price. Carbon price. So if you're a European importer, yeah, or you might think who cares who pays for the CBAM? So in the end, the total cost is the same. Doesn't matter who pays. The total cost is the same, and you're right that the total cost is the same, but other things are not the same. Yeah, so it's important to make this difference because otherwise we make incorrect conclusions in other places. And speaking of companies, we have a new sort of minimum limit for the CBAM. So the CBAM only applies to imports above 50 tons of CO2 per year. Okay, so that if you have an emission intensity of 2 tons of CO2 per ton steel, that equates, yeah, so you can do the math. So that means most small and medium enterprises are exempted from the CBAM. Yeah, so the CBAM really only mainly applies to the big companies, the big trades. Now I wanted to raise that there's one more thing which may limit these effects on green steel: substitution, that we say. So now the European importer may choose to buy steel from a different place where emissions are lower, but there's something that can limit this transition, which is that steel demand is product specific. So that means that an EU importer may buy one very specific product from a producer. Yeah, so one very specific size or thickness or coating. So even though costs increase with the CBAM for this product, it may not be possible to buy from somewhere else. Yeah, so this exposure to competition is also determined by how generic and easily replicatable the product is. And so if I need a very specific product, then the question is, how easy is it for a company with lower emissions to remake their production line so that they can now produce this product? Okay, so from there we can say that more generic steel, like a generic hot rolled coil, standard measurements, standard coatings, is more subject to competition than a very, very specific product. And I cannot give you more specifics than this because there are 3,000 different steel products and there are thousands of steel producers in 150 countries. So it's impossible to say sort of how strong is this resistive force in terms of numbers. And of course, there are other political interests. Yeah, so resilience, security, which relationships, which of course also can influence trade and the desire to remain a competitive option. But generally, if we adopt a purely economical framework, we can calculate the production cost and we can calculate the CBAM cost for different production routes, like I showed earlier. And then we can take all of that into a big computational model. So we need as I said, many variables. You need a computer to solve for these things. And that can solve for exactly which country will be competitive with what steel production process and when, and how much every country should produce through every production process, like given constraints of availability of scrap or iron ore quality and all of these things. So this is what we did in our research. And yeah, so we analyzed for 10 countries and that was 30,000 variables. Yeah, so it's difficult for the human brain to understand it because you can't understand that. But so now if we account for all 150 countries, so 10 countries, 30,000 variables, 150 countries, that's like billions of variables, okay? So if you feel this is a bit tricky, don't worry, completely normal. Moving on to cover a few more potential effects, but perhaps let's start with where the politics is at the moment, which is who has the most CBAM impact? And generally, there are two different narratives here that are floating around. Some EU producers say they are the losers and want to delay free allocation. And some, the phase out, and some countries outside the EU say they are the losers. So who's right? Because the statements contradict each other. And so they can't both be right, at least not without some modification to these arguments. And the modification is exactly this. And so what we found by modeling is that those with the most impact are some EU producers and some developing countries. And I'll go through why for both of these. Okay, so starting with the EU, as I said earlier, when carbon costs put BF-BOF at the marginal market price and competitiveness becomes increasingly dependent on decarbonisation, so that means the continued competitiveness depends on how easy it is for you to decarbonize. And in the case of the EU, it turns out quite difficult because most steel capacity is in countries where green steel is very expensive. But that's not the point, at least not entirely. The point is that the EU has much more steel capacity to decarbonize than exporters have to decarbonize. Yeah, so the EU domestic production is much larger than the imports. So imports are only a small share compared to the domestic production volume. So if all imports to the EU are decarbonized, so every exporter to the EU decarbonizes green steel, which is about 29 megatons, I think. And the EU also decarbonizes 29 megatons, so both exactly the same. So every other country has decarbonized, everyone is below the market price now. Then the EU still has 60 megatons of BF-BOF, which sets the marginal market price. Yeah, so the EU has to decarbonize much more to keep up with the market. It has to decarbonize much faster. So the disadvantage here is that EU producers have to decarbonize more steel capacity than each individual exporter to the EU. So it's easier for, only talking about the numbers, the production volume. So China exports, I think, 5 megatons to the EU, and 5 is easier than 80. Okay, so it's easier for each exporter to decarbonize than all of the steel capacity, which moves the market. And countries outside the EU can collectively, so together, can decarbonize more steel capacity than they currently export to the EU. And this way they can gain market share by outcompeting EU producers. So if you're in the EU, in the audience here, and you're wondering where the sort of anti-decarbonization politics has come from, this is it. Yeah. So this is the reason, because of course all traditional EU steel makers that work with the market, they know this. And then the situation gets further complicated with sort of consideration to resilience and security as like counter arguments to no, we need to keep it. But these aspects of competition is really the core reason. Yeah. So because there will be a yes.
Sorry, selfishly cutting you off there to make sure that I understand the point that you're making. So did you say that because EU would have to decarbonize its whole all of the production in the EU, that's why it's harder for the EU and more costly than for other exporting countries because they each export less than the entire capacity in the EU. Was that what you said?
Yeah, I think it's a simplification, but I think it's good enough. I think so because it's really about a combination of factors. But the point is, you can think BF-BOF is going to set the marginal market price. Yeah. So even if the EU produces 1 ton or like 1 gram of BF-BOF, then that's going to be the market price. And any green steel that comes into the EU is going to push the BF-BOF above the marginal market price. So it's, yeah, so you're right what you say. It's because you have to decarbonize. So you have to decarbonize much, much more steel capacity to stay competitive, because any BF-BOF sets the marginal market price, and any country can export anything and push the BF-BOF above to replace it. And then, so that's one thing. And then the question is, so why is it so hard to decarbonize? It's because most steel capacity is in countries where green steel is very expensive. So it's the two things together. Okay. As I say, it's some EU countries. Yeah. So for example, and I mean, some Swedish companies obviously realized this a couple of years ago, and it's a genius business opportunity because BF-BOF is going to set the marginal price. So if you're green, you're cheaper. So it only applies to some EU countries. Okay. Moving on to moving on to the developing countries. And okay, so why developing countries? Well, the main reason is that the amount of capital and financing required to invest in green steel to stay competitive is just simply not feasible in many countries. Also in many developed countries, it's not feasible. But so in a way, it's at least more difficult. Yeah. So, but why do I say some developing countries? Why not all? And in fact, the total impact on developing countries is less than what we thought in the beginning. And why is that? It's because while many produce steel, only a few produce the specific products that are covered by the CBAM. Yeah, so not all steel products are covered by the CBAM. And here's a study by the World Bank that calculated this. And as you can see, for example, Egypt and Africa is quite exposed, but many other countries, not so much. Yeah, so the impact is the biggest on developing countries in general, but it's not that many. Well, it's not that many that we thought in the beginning when we got the CBAM 2 years ago. Okay, so but nonetheless, it does of course remain a problem for the countries that are affected, because of course they want to grow their economies by exporting iron and steel. But at the same time, we of course have to put a price on emissions for the climate. So that's why this is such a tricky issue. But it's important to note that it's actually written in the legislation, so in the CBAM legislation, that the EU will continuously monitor the impact of CBAM on LDCs. Okay, so continuously over the entire time, it will monitor the impact on LDCs. I don't know why LDCs have not been exempted from the CBAM yet, but it could happen in the future. Yeah? So we just don't know at the moment, I suppose. And if you're still with me and paying attention, you'll be pleased to know this is the last chapter. And so moving on to something which I call indirect effects. And I only wanted to go over this quite briefly because the CBAM can and will have some of those as well. So we've already talked about the sort of direct effects the CBAM can have on the steel market, but there are also other things that can happen. And so one, and I briefly mentioned this already, is that countries can implement a carbon price to retain the revenue. Yeah. And that's, of course, a good thing, because that means now there's a carbon price in that country for all production. Yeah. And so that's a positive. So we can see the sort of carbon pricing instruments could spread around the world, and we would have more carbon that is, or more emissions that are priced than before. Yeah, because the economic incentive is to reduce the CBAM cost as much as possible. There's a danger here, which is why also this Delegated or Implementing Act is so important, which is that let's say you adopt a carbon price, the company pays for the emissions go to the government, but then the government takes the money and puts it back into the company. So it goes back to subsidize the emissions originally. So you deduct the CBAM cost, but it's not a real cost for the producer. And that's, of course, well, first of all, it's not good for the climate, but that's also going to create some serious competition issues for producers in the EU, because the ETS is a very real cost. Yeah. So there's both sort of opportunities and challenges here. So the question is, how do you verify a carbon price has been paid, or an effective carbon price has been paid? And then, of course, countries, as I said, we had country A, we deduced this entire thing from country A and country B alone. So and we showed it's a general thing. So other countries can also adopt CBAM. So that's also one thing that is happening, actually. Second is, when establishing these carbon pricing mechanisms, and you need the sort of methodology, like how do I count my emissions? How do I report? How do I verify? So MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And by using the CBAM to calculate emissions, you've now also been given a very good methodology, yeah, for measuring emissions that you can use to adopt, to implement for your other sectors. Okay, so there's also some good knowledge transfer that can happen here. I mean, that can, yeah, okay, we don't know. And the third is quite a complicated one, which is recirculation of CBAM revenue. So all the revenue the CBAM is creating, so people are paying CBAM, and the money ends up with the commission, that could maybe be recirculated to be put back into a country to finance decarbonization efforts. And you would think, oh, well, that sounds great, amazing. So we use the money from emissions to finance decarbonization efforts. Sounds amazing. So why hasn't this happened already? Well, in fact, it's not really that easy. Yeah. So the UNFCCC, of course, thinks this would be great. Yeah. So in terms of global climate cooperation, that would be great, but it's not WTO compliant. So let's say India pays CBAM, and then the EU takes the money and finances decarbonization in Nigeria. Yeah, so that would be non-WTO compliant. So so some people are saying like, oh, the EU is so stupid. Why don't they just do this? It's because it's actually really difficult, and you have these two bodies that practically contradict each other. Yeah, so the UNFCCC likes it, WTO doesn't like it, and it gets even. What's going on?
Go ahead, Constantin. There was someone unmuted.
Okay.
Sorry.
Um,
And just a reminder that you have 2 minutes
yeah,
left.
this is my last slide, in fact. Yeah, so finishing up. So, and some countries have also been saying the CBAM is not, so have been accusing the EU for saying the CBAM is not WTO compliant. Some of these countries are the same countries that are asking to recirculate the CBAM revenue, which, right? So you can see sometimes you also have incoherent positions which say, oh, we think the WTO is good in one way, or in one way we want it to be WTO compliant, but in the other way we don't want it to be WTO compliant. So that's politics. So these are potential indirect effects. Yeah, we don't know. It's happening in the future, but if we can sort of guess and think. And I thought I would actually leave you there. So feel free to contact me if you want to talk steel or CBAM or climate in general. And I will hand it over back to the fantastic organizers. So thank you very much for paying attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Constantine, thank you so much for that. I know that was a long presentation. I'm hoping that you have a minute to drink a sip of water. We will actually go into a 5-minute break now, because I realize that this is a fair bit of content. For those of you who have been putting questions in the chat, Amanda and Carlotta are making a note of it, and we will have some space to ask those questions in the Q&A. We'd ask you all to come back in exactly 5 minutes. So that's about 7:25 p.m. IST, or it is, looking at the time zone here, it's like, is it 4 o'clock CEST? Is that right?
It's 3:55 CEST.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. All right, so let's everyone take a break, but please come back, because the next set of speakers are going to be just as good, and we'll be talking about the impact of CBAM in markets that are exporting, using India as a case study. Thank you all. See you in 5. Great. I think we'll start again. Just hoping that everybody else is back on the Zoom meeting. Wonderful. So now please let me introduce the next set of speakers who are from India, and they will be discussing the implications of CBAM in exporting markets using India as a case study. We have two speakers. The first is Dr. Kasturi Das. She's a professor of economics and sustainability area and the chairperson of sustainability and social responsibility at the Institute of Management Technology, IMT Ghaziabad in India. Dr. Das is an economist, a trade and climate policy practitioner, as well as an educator with more than 2 decades of professional experience. Most recently, Dr. Das was a Fulbright Kalam Climate Fellow for Academic and Professional Excellence at Yale, a Chevening Crisp Fellow among several other positions. And she has been serving as a member of the High-Level Advisory Committee on Trade and Environment as part of the Government of India, and was also a member of the World Economic Forum's Expert Group on Trade and Climate Change. The other speaker is Dr. Kaushik Bandyopadhyay. He is a professor and chairperson for the Center for Business Sustainability at the Indian Institute of Management, Lucknow in India. Dr. Bandyopadhyay brings more than 2 decades of academic policy research and administrative experiences. He was engaged with the International Institute of Sustainable Development as a principal policy advisor prior to joining IIM Lucknow. Until recently, he was serving as a program director at the Department of Business and Sustainability at the Energy and Resources Institute Terry School of Advanced Studies, and was also the founding head of department. He's also a member of the advisory committee at the Confederation of Indian Industry and a member of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry National Task Force on ESG. So we've got a couple of experts with extensive experience. A reminder to please again put your questions in the chat, and after the presentation, there will be time for a Q&A. Let me hand over now to Dr. Das. Thank you, Dr. Das and Dr. Bandyopadhyay.
Thank you, Ms. Sakshi and all the organizers. I hope I'm audible. Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here today among all of you, and we can see that there is a large number of people who have gathered online, and there is a lot of questions that are already coming up. And I must thank on behalf of both of us, Dr. Constantin, for the excellent presentation, which has made our life much more easier. So actually, I was working on the slides and I removed a lot of slides because he already covered all those. So we will try to focus, very briefly on some of the findings from a study that Professor Kaushik and myself undertook, and it got published recently. So we'll talk about it. Just a moment, I hope. Yes. So, as Dr. Constantin already mentioned about CBAM, and in great detail he talked about its implications also, we are here to share the case of Indian steel sector as a case study based on what we found, and we are going to share our methodology as well. Before starting, I would like to point out that when we look at the European Union CBAM, there are two things that they try to achieve through this measure. One is to tackle the risk of carbon leakage, of course. The other is to encourage enhanced decarbonization in EU's trading partners. And it is the second objective of EU CBAM that is the point of departure of our study. Because what we have done in this paper that got recently published in a leading journal, International Environmental Agreements, Politics, Law and Economics, is to look at impact of EU CBAM on steel decarbonization in India. And we started with this objective and the related research question that will CBAM really encourage enhanced decarbonization in the hard-to-abate sectors in EU's key trading partners from the global south? we took Indian steel sector as a case in point to look into this question. Now, why focus on steel industry and why India per se? So a lot has already been spoken about the steel sector, but just to briefly mention some data that India is the second largest producer of steel globally. And this data you can see. And you can also see that where we are, despite being the second largest producer in the world, we are a distant second compared to China, which covers close to 54% of global production of steel. That said, why it is very important for us to understand that enhanced decarbonization in steel is an imperative for achieving the Paris Agreement's goal. And when we look at the Paris Agreement's goal, particularly we are aware of the emission reduction targets of 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C. And it is the industrial decarbonization in the hard to abate sectors like steel, aluminium, glass, etc., which are going to play a very important role. And steel covers a huge role in this context because around 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by steel sector alone. And India has a particularly important role to play because as Dr. Constantin was pointing out about different technologies of production, and how different developing countries are situated in terms of their emissions on an average. If you look at India, although India is the second largest producer, and as per the future projections, production of steel in India is going to increase, Indian steel is also highly emitting. And it is one of the very highly emitting sectors as far as steel sector globally is concerned. And average emissions in steel sector in India is far higher than the global average. And that is something which makes it an imperative to see how we are going to decarbonize our steel production. And there comes the role of the CBAM and how far that is going to influence our decarbonization journey. So with that background, let me share with you the conceptual framework of our study. Our conceptual framework draws on what is called the Brussels effect, as espoused by Professor Anu Bradford in her 2012 as well as 2020 studies that she came up with. The second one is a book, which I'm showing here. So the Brussels effect, what it is all about. The Brussels effect talks about the EU's ability and the power to influence the regulatory scenario in its trading partners unilaterally, that is, without getting into any kind of cooperation, but only through its market potential and its market power. What does that mean? Suppose that we are thinking about the steel sector in India, and India is exporting steel to EU. Now think of a particular company which is exporting steel from India to EU, and EU comes up with a regulation. It could be anywhere. It could be in the space of not only CBAM, but it could be any other regulation which affects the sector. Now, if it has to continue to export to EU, it must abide by that regulation. That is an imperative. Now, if that is the case, then suppose that this company, which is from India, is undertaking certain measures to comply with the EU regulation. Now, once it has done that, of course, it has to undertake a lot of expenses to do so. And having done that, it also would like to see that it is also maintaining its competitiveness everywhere, wherever it is present, be it in the domestic market as well as other export market. Now, if we think of the domestic market, and if there are other players in India who are not exporting to EU and therefore do not have to abide by the higher standard that EU has come up with, then those particular companies in India who are catering to the domestic market, they do not have to undertake the extra cost to abide by the EU standard. So what does that mean? It means that this first company that was trying to export to EU and hence had to improve upon its own standard to comply with the EU requirement will now not find a level playing field vis-a-vis those other companies who are based out of India and catering to the domestic market. Now, what would be the reaction of that first company, which is not facing the level playing field and is finding it difficult to maintain its competitiveness? Obviously, you expect that it might go and lobby with the regulators in India to come up with higher standard. And if that happens, then we can say that there is a Brussels effect that is trying to play around here, to the extent that the regulator improves upon their standard and bring it closer to the EU standard. So that is about the Brussels effect. The point is, we said that it is taking place unilaterally and not through any kind of country to country cooperation, because it is the exporting company which is out of India and facing difficulty in the EU market, had to comply with it, and then faced competitiveness concern in the domestic market, went back to the regulator and influenced upon the regulator to go for higher standard, which is closer to the EU standard. That is about the Brussels effect. So we, in our study, tried to understand to what extent Brussels effect can play a role in the context of EU CBAM as far as steel decarbonization in India is concerned. We looked at it first at the level of the steel industry, and when we say steel industry, we looked at the big companies as well as small companies or small and medium enterprises. We also looked at the impact of the Brussels effect on the regulatory and policy space. So these are the two levels we have looked at the Brussels effect. Coming to our methodology, why this particular research study is very relevant for today's conversation is because this is not a technical study that we did based on some kind of modeling or projections. Rather, we thought, and when we looked at, we are not sharing the literature survey that we did, which is there in our paper, and we will be happy to share the link of the paper for the audience who may be interested to know more. We'll be extremely happy to share that. But for the time being, let me share that we looked at the literature and we found that although there have been a lot of studies on CBAM or border carbon adjustment that have taken place, and a lot of studies are also trying to look at the future impact of CBAM on different exporting countries, we could not find many studies who tried to go back to the real stakeholders and understand from them how they are looking at it. Is it a problem or is it an opportunity? And how they are planning to deal with it. So those things were not looked at, and that was the motivation behind this study. So our methodology was based on qualitative research method, and we actually undertook interviews of 41 key informants between July 2023 and October 2024. We undertook 43 interviews. Some of it were done in online mode, and some of these was done in offline, in-person mode. And we collected the information and we from different sources. Apart from that, we did an extensive survey of the secondary literature. When we say literature, it involves all sorts of literature because our paper is very much interdisciplinary in its approach. We also collected secondary data on, and some of the findings we are going to share. And although the details of the stakeholders that we interviewed, the 41 experts who are very senior level people at whatever organization they are working with, but we did not reveal their identity in the paper because we had to maintain the secrecy so that we get authentic information from them. But this particular slide is showing the different categories of stakeholders we reached out to. And you can see that we not only covered the industries, the industry associations, but we also went to the civil society organizations, to academia, to policymakers, and so on. So we now move on to discuss some of the salient features of the steel industry in India and what are some of the challenges and policy initiatives that have been undertaken by India. I, at this stage, request Professor Kaushik to intervene and take it forward. Kaushik, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this discussion. So I'm glad to see so many participants, and I'm thankful to the organizers, Climate Catalyst and other members of the team for organizing this wonderful workshop. I would call it a workshop because it's more of a demystifying nature. So that's why it's a workshop. And thank you, Kasturi, for actually talking about setting the CBAM in context and what are the issues. And thanks, Constantin, for the wonderful presentation. In fact, you have tried your best to demystify CBAM. Of course, appreciating the fact that CBAM is it's a technical subject. So naturally, one cannot really remove all the technicalities from the presentations, but you have done a great job in terms of at least explaining to the broader audience what CBAM is all about. But I'd like to just take a deep dive on why we are talking about steel sector industry in India. I think Kasturi has given a background that it's the second largest producer in the world. But the steel industry in India is very unique in itself with unique challenges and heterogeneity that it is having. So if you look at the steel sector in India, there are primary as well as the secondary steel sector. And the primary steel sectors are mainly relying on the BFOF process. Constantin has tried to explain that. This is blast furnace, oxidized furnace process. So mainly the big companies or the integrated steel producers are relying on that technology. And if you look at the emission intensity, average emission intensity of the steel sector in India, it's around 2.54 tons of carbon dioxide per tons of crude steel. TCS, which you can see in the slide, it stands for tons of crude steel. Now, within that, I think if you look at the emission intensity of the blast furnace, I think it's very high. And it's all across the globe, it's pretty high, unless you are going for using scrap in the electric arc furnace, which I'll come to shortly. So the emission intensity of the blast furnace of the primary steel producers in India is around 3 tons of carbon dioxide per tons of crude steel. And if you look at the secondary steel sector, it's primarily dominated by the small and medium enterprises. So I think I could see there was a question asking about the secondary scrap. I think in one part, I'd like to say that in India, the secondary steel sector, which is dominated by the small and medium scale industries, have two sets of technology that they follow. One is obviously the DRI-EAF production route, which uses the scrap. And the emission intensity is a bit less because they are dependent on scrap. The second one is induction furnace, and induction furnace emission intensity is pretty high. In fact, it's 2.3 tons of carbon dioxide per tons of crude steel. So it's basically the BFOF and the IF that is accounting for the very high emission intensity of steel in India. Could you please go to the second slide, Kasturi? Could you move to the next slide, Kasturi? Yes. So let me just quickly talk about some of the barriers which the steel industry in India actually faces. In fact, Constantin has got into it, got into the issues at a very broad level or very high level. I would like to go into it a little bit more details. Now, if you'd like to see that, is it very easy to kind of actually accept the bout of pressure that is being precipitated by CBAM, one needs to actually understand that what actually are the barriers towards steel decarbonization in India. Because if one doesn't have an idea of that, we may not be able to comment on what implications will CBAM have on the steel sector in India. So if we look at the barriers that currently the steel sector in India counters, these include the supply side barriers. And if I talk about the supply side barriers, it's mainly includes the availability of the fuel and feedstocks. So if I talk about this in a little bit more details, India is stuck with the inferior fuel quality mix, which leads to increased energy consumption. And I have mentioned that BF-OF process, which the ISP actually uses, they depend on this inferior fuel quality mix to a large extent. And there is a dearth of availability of high quality feedstocks like steel scrap, and there's a huge dependence on import for the steel scrap. There's a problem with the non-availability of the domestic coking coal and continued dependence on imported coke to actually meet the high demand for steel by the end-use sectors. There's a problem of inadequacy in availability of the relatively cleaner fuel like natural gas, because number one, its lion's share of it is imported. And add on to that, the price volatility in the iron ore, coking coal, and natural gas due to geopolitical and other factors, which just compounds the problem. So I think it's not so easy. I mean, we cannot just simplify the process so easily. That the problem is much more compounded. Now, coming to the technology-related problem, you know that we already know that the carbon capture, utilization, storage technology is yet to be commercially viable. And there are huge challenges due to the non-availability of the storage capacity and capture performances. There's also inadequate data, for instance, on the potential of the geological storage. Add to this that come to the question of usage of hydrogen in the blast furnace. Now that is basically in a demonstration phase, and some of the ISPs are actually exploring that, but they are all in a pilot stage and yet to be commercially viable. There are also problems with utility level battery storage or pumped hydro, which unless they are introduced, I think we can't think of going into decarbonization in full swing. Coming to the organizational barriers, I think there are issues with respect to the skills to handle the new technologies, which invariably, in fact, if you go to our papers, this has been deciphered in more details. Coming to the demand side barriers, I think there is a continuous increase in steel demand that's going to come in the near future. But there's a bigger problem with respect to, Constantin has talked about the issues of green steel, but there's a clear problems with respect to the lack of clarity and definition of green steel, because due to the lack of any legal definitions or any standardized way to define the green steel. So what is green steel for some country A may not be the green steel for country B. So, and there's also a limited market for these green steel products, and there's a problem also with respect to the private and public procurement policies at currently, which has explicit mandate for using green steel, that compounds the problem further. So, coming to that, so we have a huge demand side barriers as well. In fact, I would prefer to use the word decarbonized steel instead of green steel, because that would augur more well with the end users than using the word green steel, which is slightly hard on them. Because I think what exactly would be, how is the green steel going to be used? What exactly would be the demand for green steel? Who are going to be the end users of that is yet to be clarified to adequate extent. Coming to the investment barriers, I think Constantin has gone into it in considerable extent, but I would like to basically say that the steel sector is basically cyclical in nature, and there are huge issues with respect to the cash flow generations in case of the sector in itself. And the Indian steel sector has also been witnessing the large-scale financial defaults, and that creates the problems further. So the low-carbon technologies, which, for instance, I think Sakshi was just referring to something about the secondary steel. So if you come to the low carbon technologies like CCUS, talking about the green hydrogen, they are highly capital intensive and they require large investment volumes that may be challenging to organize for in order to make them commercially viable. Add to this the increasing cost of borrowings and cost of equity that simply makes larger capital expansion project commercially unviable, for instance, in India. So, as I mentioned, that absence of an acceptable legal definitions of green steel creates a huge amount of uncertain market conditions, which adds up to the cost. It also increases the incentive for greenwashings and makes it more challenging to access finance. Now, when I talked to, for instance, the representative from IMF, I could understand they were just kind of mulling on simply putting in money on decarbonization, but the funds from the international financial institutions have not really been forthcoming to actually beef up the process of decarbonizations. Although big players like the ISPs actually they could manage to get funding from the state-run Indian commercial banks based on their balance sheet. Looking at the secondary steel sector, which is the small and medium scale industries, the cost and plight is actually very high. Now, coming to the last part, which is the social barriers, this is something which I think I've pointed out, because you see that because of this heterogeneity and even if the ISPs are actually better prepared when it comes to addressing the challenges of decarbonizations, when we come to, for instance, the small and medium scale industries, they don't have adequate awareness and on documentation related formalities. There are problems with respect to financial literacies. There are high transaction costs and there are high risk perceptions and low margins for funders that compounds the problem further. There are high interest rate and long payback periods coupled with the poor credit worthiness that compounds the problem all the more for the MSMEs. So I think one of the issues which Constantin was trying to raise that how exactly would be the utility of the CBAM revenue, and he was taking the example of like taking the proceeds of CBAM from India and investing in, for instance, decarbonization in Nigeria. Yesterday, we were in another forum, I think, where we were trying to actually discuss how best actually to kind of use these proceeds. So one of the issues which I think Ignacio was and some of the representatives from DG Climate was kind of agreeing to was to de-risk the process of financing, because there's a risk guarantee that we actually need in order to make this technology financially viable. So without that risk, possibly that proceeds could be used for creating that fund to give that risk guarantee to aid in the process of decarbonization. And that's what I think we basically kind of deliberated on. So I think, could you please move on to the next slide, Kasturi?
Dr. Kaushik, just a quick check on 3 minutes left for your presentation.
Yeah, sure. So I think the India government already has a policy process in place, and they basically have like kind of arrange the policies in terms of the short term, the medium term, and the long term. In the short term, the focus is on energy and resource efficiency, just to kind of get hold of the low hanging fruits. We know that very well. And we are also currently doing a study on if some of the auxiliary fuel could be currently used, and we are trying to rank them in a separate academic study that we are doing. In the medium term, the deep decarbonization technology with the government focus would be on deep decarbonization technology, which includes the green hydrogen-based steel making and carbon capture and utilization and storage. And in the long term, the policy focus will shift to disruptive and novel technologies. So with that, I think a background on what just unveiling or unraveling the situation of Indian steel sector and what are the challenges to decarbonization, I will hand it over to Kasturi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaushik. So I'll very briefly touch upon the other findings from the study. This is regarding, what happens to India's export implications. And here you can see from this graph that the share of EU in India's total world export of steel has shown an upward movement, particularly since 2021-22, reaching as high as 31% in 2023-24. And this indicates the importance of the EU market for steel exporters in India. And this graph actually looked at, when you look at the CBAM law, it's not that all the items under chapter 72 and 73, which deals with iron, steel, and items of iron and steel, not all items are covered. So we tried to do this data analysis by culling out the data where we tried to see that when we look at the CBAM covered items of steel and iron and steel items and those exports from India to EU, what is the share of those exports, and we could find that 84 to 89% of India's total exports of iron and steel to EU are actually in CBAM covered items, so which is huge. And we know that as per the World Bank index, which is trying to look at CBAM exposure, India is actually the third most vulnerable country, and that is a very important point to note. So what strategic options do companies have? Of course, one option is that they can continue to export to EU. And if they have to do that, they have to comply with the MRV requirement and also have to try to reduce their carbon intensity of their output so that they remain competitive. Other option is to diversify to domestic market or to other export destinations. So coming to domestic market, this particular table shows that India does have a huge potential in terms of domestic market. So that is definitely an option. And here we again try to look at the trade data, and our findings indicate these highlighted things, these countries are from EU, where we can see that we are already exporting, but there are other countries also where India is currently exporting. So these could be the destinations we can start off with. And we need to, of course, do a far more in-depth study to explore the potential and the feasibility of diversifying exports if we plan to ignore the EU market. That brings us to the final part of the findings, that is whether Brussels effect is found to hold. We try to do it at two levels. When we look at the big players, these are some of the big players, and our findings indicate that no, they're not going to ignore the EU market, but they are not in a position to convert their entire output to similar low carbon level as a result of CBAM. What they are planning to do rather is to convert only that part of their output that they plan to export to EU, make it lower carbon, and the rest of it, which they plan to use in the domestic market or elsewhere, relatively higher carbon, at least in the immediate short term. And these are some of the initiatives taken by the big players, which I'm going to skip due to paucity of time. Coming to small players, Kaushik already explained the challenges they are facing. So we could find that they may be exposed to CBAM either directly if they're exporting to EU market, which may not be that many, but they may be impacted by CBAM as a part of being in the steel supply chain somewhere. And because of the different complexities and the challenges they are facing, they would be very vulnerable to impact of CBAM. We could not find the Brussels effect on the government and regulatory, policy and regulation, though. And that brings us to the final part of our policy implications. And we would argue that if European Union and in other countries that plan to bring in border carbon adjustment, they can think of coming up with designs of border carbon adjustment which may be helpful for their exporting partners to decarbonize. And here are some of the design recommendations that we came up with, which is self-explanatory. So I'm not going into reading it this out. Finally, it may be noted that European Union is not alone, and there are already other countries who are planning, border carbon adjustment. So there is a call for cooperation, which we think is very important, so that the exporters do not end up with a new set of spaghetti rolls of rules and regulations that they have to comply with in a particular sector if they try to export to different destinations. So we stop at that and look forward to the interaction. Thank you.
Thanks so much both for the great presentations, and also thanks to our first speaker, Constantin, for that, and participants that have already posted questions. We know it's quite late for most of you and very long webinar, but thanks for staying. Amanda and I have been collating questions in the chat, so we're going to start with with those in the chat. And if we have time, we will open the floor for additional questions. So there were a couple of questions related to this point, and it's about would a slowdown of the phase out of free allowances under the EU ETS slow down or complicate the implementation of CBAM, and how likely do you think the postponing of the EU ETS free allowance phase out is? Maybe that's more for you, Constantin.
I'll take that. Thanks, Carlotta. And thank you for all the questions. Okay, so I'll just start. So that was 3 questions, I think. So I may have you to repeat them. But starting with the last, how likely is it? Well, I'm not a policymaker. I don't represent the EU, so I'm not gonna be able to give you an answer for that. How likely it is. Sometimes I think it's more likely. Sometimes I think it's less likely. But the European Commission, at least, has been super clear that there's no talk of delay currently. Yeah, so most of these rumors again come from others. So this is not something that has been confirmed by the EU. And I think the first question was what does it mean for the CBAM?
If the slowdown, yes, if there's a slowdown in the EU ETS, would it complicate the implementation of CBAM?
Well, it's you can only, so the thing about fair trade, right? So we said the CBAM cannot be stronger than the EU ETS. So if you delay the EU ETS, it would also delay the CBAM. Yeah, does that?
Yeah, wonderful.
I think that covers it. Next one is on carbon leakage, and there were actually a few on this. But is it possible that companies simply export all their scrap-based EAF steel to the EU while keeping their higher emission production for domestic use, thereby not actually changing anything outside the EU in terms of green steel production?
Okay, I think I'm gonna have a stab at this as well. And the answer to that is yes and no. Okay, and this is it's a bit complicated, this, and so as I showed in the slide, so scrap is currently not covered in the CBAM. And why? As I said, the CBAM cannot be stronger than the EU ETS, and the EU ETS has had free allocation, so no scrap in the EU has paid a carbon price, so therefore there can be no carbon price on scrap from outside the EU. Okay, and to make it a bit more complicated, there are 2 different kinds of scrap. Yeah, so I mean, for this purpose, there are 2 different kinds of scrap. There's pre-consumer scrap and there's post-consumer scrap. So pre-consumer scrap is at production of the steel itself. So you produce some steel. Now this is aluminium, but you can pretend it's it's steel. And let's say you need this to be 20 centimeters, but you produce it slightly larger and then you cut it off. So that's before it has come to the customer. So that's very high quality scrap because it's the original steel before it's been in a bridge or in a car or in a table. And of course that scrap was just produced. So there's a certain amount of emissions associated with that scrap, with that pre-consumer scrap. And as soon as the phase out of free allocation starts, that pre-consumer scrap will have paid a carbon price through the ETS in the EU, but not through the CBAM because no scrap is currently included in the CBAM. Then there's post-consumer scrap, yeah, which is after, so you produce steel, you create a product, then the product is old, the bridge gets rusty, you tear it down, that's post-consumer scrap, and then you can recycle that in an EAF. And there's a certain time between these things, between where it was produced and where you've collected it. Okay, so there's a time element here. And this leads to the question, which is something people have popularly referred to, the so-called scrap loophole, which is that the CBAM does not cover scrap. I'm right away going to go ahead and say that this is very, very overstated. Yeah. So how big this loophole is. And in fact, when people say the scrap loophole, is actually two things. And one of them I would say, yeah, is a loophole. And one of them I would say, no, is not a loophole. So, so pre-consumer scrap, as I said, that would have a carbon price to the ETS. So therefore it should also have a carbon price in the CBAM, but it doesn't. So people can, or other companies outside the EU can take that and remelt and use it, and it will have zero emissions associated with it, even though you just produced it. So that's a loophole. So you can put in more pre-consumer scrap in your products because the CBAM doesn't detect those emissions. So that's the so-called loophole. Now here's the thing. There's very little pre-consumer scrap. Yeah. So the effect of this loophole on the actual market is much, much, much smaller than what is typically being argued. So now for the second thing about post-consumer scrap, which there's of course much, much more post-consumer scrap. But the thing is that it's about quality. And so there are two arguments here. One, which is if you produce, again, there's not that much high quality scrap. So there's a limited effect on how much scrap EAF production can actually compete with this product. Yeah. So it's in one way a non-issue. Yeah. So it over time, as we learn how to produce better secondary steel, it becomes more of an issue. And the question is how much of an issue is it now and in the beginning? And the second is, well, I mean, isn't that really a good thing anyway then? So the producers have lowered their emissions by using more scrap, and the EU producers haven't, so it's a competitive disadvantage for them. So
in the EU market, yes, but there would still be carbon leakage. Okay, but thank you. That was a good.
No, but but it's not carbon leakage because the scrap is the post-consumer scrap produced steel has lower emissions than EU BF-BOF. So it's globally it's a climate benefit, not a climate disadvantage. So it's not carbon leakage. It's just a competitive problem. So the carbon leakage is only for this pre-consumer scrap, of which there's very, very little. And so there's this idea like, also, can you purposely, or the question is, when does steel become scrap? Yeah. So if I cut this thing here, it's still the same product. So when does it become scrap? Yeah, I just lost the train of thought.
I guess the question was on the allocation in what market. I saw here that actually there's, I mean, we have experts on the call who had a comment on the probability part of the last question. So Camille, are you there and would you want to come in on that?
Yeah. Hello everyone, Camille from WWF, the European Policy Office, with Lisa from our WWF German office. So very nice to see you all. I think it's amazing that we have 60 people in this workshop. So thanks to the organizer. And I just wanted to come back on the issue of possible delay in terms of phasing, phase out. So phasing of CBAM factor and phase out of free allocation. I think what's important to remember is that in the EU context right now, and Constantin explained that very well with the link with the EU ETS, the EU ETS directive is a very, very debated file, and we're going to enter into a revision for the post-2030 period next year. And despite the fact that the Commission is quite clear on, of course, like we won't have any delay in terms of phase out of free allocation, I think that's going to be the most debated point in the EU ETS directive to come for the post-2030 framework. So far, also for all ETS sector, we have phase out until 2030 because the next phase is not written yet. But once it's going to be written, I'm pretty sure this is going to be reopened. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be with strong ask from the industry, which resonate a lot here in some institution, especially within the European Parliament at the moment, to delay the timeline. So I won't be so sure about all of this going as planned. So just wanted to mention that here, and maybe also that's why it's great to have this community. We learn so much about CBAM, but also the link with the ETS, because I think that's going to be the next battle for this community as well. So yeah, thanks a lot.
And
Thanks.
let me just jump in there really quickly. So I agree with all of the things that Camille said very well. I also think the opening of the ETS directive to determine the sort of what happens after 2030 is going to be a very critical point. But I just wanted to differentiate two things. So when we're talking about a delay, it's a delay of the phase out itself, and the opening of the directive is rather redetermining how big the CBAM factor is. So it's really, and so yes, it also delays the ultimate timeline for the phase out, of course. But now the debate has been: do we start CBAM in 2026 or later? So these are two different things. But equally important, of course. I just wanted to clarify that for those that are not in the EU.
Thank you. And thank you, Camille, for jumping in there. We have another question for Dr. Kasturi and Dr. Kaushik. You mentioned the iron induction pathway in your presentation, and there was a question around what is the prime reason why it is more carbon intensive, and if it is because furnaces use sponge iron produced with blast furnaces.
Yes, of course, that is one of the reasons why. Indeed, I think that is one of the reasons why the induction furnaces happens to be more carbon intensive. That's a reason in a way. And they are like super small scale sectors and using the fossil fuels phenomenally. And that's one of the reasons why the carbon intensity is very high. So that is one of the reasons why the induction furnace, which she's talking about, is correct. And I think you can go into, if you really want to know about how these induction furnaces are actually used to produce steel and why they are more carbon intensive, there's a wonderful document that has been brought out by TERI with a primary level survey across the induction furnaces in India, which is available in the TERI website. So you can even go and look at that in more details.
Amazing, thank you. Is there any way can someone link to that has that website open, and then we get it in the chat for everyone? The next question is on is related to South Africa. So for countries in the global South, and now this question refers especially to South Africa. CBAM impacts South Africa's iron and steel industry by increasing the cost of exporting to the EU, reducing market competitiveness, and as we see currently, posing risks to jobs. How does CBAM consider the finance required by certain countries and the pace at which such countries can decarbonize? So I'm not sure who wants to give a go for this.
I can give a first stab, and then if someone else has something to add, they can add that. So first of all, just to very simply answer the question, how does the CBAM consider? Well, it doesn't. Yeah, so but it could. So I and also Professor Kaushik also talked about this recirculation of, so that's something that could happen, but currently it doesn't. So now and that sort of answers the question, but I do want to raise I think the key topic, I think the bottom tone of that question, which is, so South Africa, developing country, hurts the economy because you cannot export as much and gain revenue because the CBAM imposes a fee, and then you're not as competitive. And that's precisely right. So, and is exactly as I said in my presentation, is this is the problem, because on one hand you do want to have that those exports for your GDP, but at the same time for the climate, of course, you don't want the emissions. Yeah. So the question I find comes down to, do we want a price on emissions or not? Yeah. And if not now, then when? And if not the EU, then who? So when are we gonna? So last year we already had 1.54 degrees. So when are we gonna start putting a real price on carbon? At some point it has to be done. And so it's a tricky geopolitical problem nonetheless. Yeah.
May I add a little bit to what Constantin has just said?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, I don't want to get into the details, but I would still like to raise this issue that we are aware of the historical emissions and the historical responsibilities which are embedded in the UNFCCC framework itself. And a lot has been talked about it. So I don't want to get into details, but you raised this and you provoked me to jump in, Constantine, when you said that whether countries should go for pricing carbon, and if not now, then when? And if not you, then who? Now, if not now, then when? Yeah, of course, this is the time. But then, if you look at, say, India is now coming up with its own CCTS, which is own carbon market. But if you, don't get me wrong, I'm just giving an argument, so nothing against you as such. So please don't get me wrong. So if you look at the EU ETS, you started in 2005, and it's 20 years, right? And we are now starting our own carbon market. It is not that India did not have anything, or it's not that India did not do anything similarly for other developing countries, but they have other imperatives as well. So of course, I think, it is very much understood that under the Paris Agreement itself, that it is very clear as part of the framework that it is not, we are not in the Kyoto world anymore, where we can rely on only developed countries to do, and developing countries and least developed countries to just fall back and take rest and wait for some other day. No. But the question still remains that there are so many other imperatives to take care of when you look at developing or least developed countries. And yes, you mentioned too many developing countries. There are developing countries and there are developing countries. So each developing country has their own set of difficulties, challenges, but all of them are trying in their own way. And they are trying to go for carbon pricing, even if it is not always the direct carbon pricing, maybe indirect carbon pricing, maybe regulations, but they are all trying to do it. It's not that they are not doing it. The question then comes is how far they are and how fast they can move, and that is the problem. And there comes this question that if you look at the CBAM timeline, because we are here talking about CBAM, it's a far bigger issue. But since we are here to discuss CBAM, so I'm talking about CBAM. So the CBAM timeline is too narrow for these countries to, cope up with this problem. So that is what our finding is, that yes, we are trying to decarbonize in India. And if you look at other developing countries, they are also trying to do that. But the CBAM window is too narrow to transform that decarbonization pathway, which is not easy. And there comes this question of finance, technology transfer, capacity building, etc. And yes, as you rightly pointed out previously, that CBAM does not take those into account. CBAM also does not discriminate as per the CBDRRC or in terms of SNDT or special and differential treatment provision of the WTO. So it looks at all the exporting countries at the same level, whether that is something like the right approach or not. That's a value judgment. I'm not getting into it. I'm just talking about the difficulties of doing something right away at the pace that is required if you really have to decarbonize just under the influence of CBAM. So I stop at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kasturi, for that. We have another question. There was a lot, so this one I think relates to all speakers, and it's, will CBAM recognize in any way other green steel taxonomies that don't necessarily align with its own standards? So for example, the Indian green steel taxonomy. And the participant there was wondering if India will have a problem with having its taxonomy be irrelevant for exporters, and whether the EU will be compelled to have certain flexibilities, and also whether this fragmentation will encourage resource shuffling rather than decarbonization. I think it's a question for whoever wants to take it, and then others can jump in. Dr. Kasturi, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know, Kaushik might like to add something, but let me very briefly say that, there comes this question of interoperability. And that's a big issue that is doing the rounds when we talk about CBAM or border carbon adjustment or any such measure which are having impact on trade. Because, think about the taxonomy that you talked about. And if you look at the CBAM, for instance, and you're talking about not only taxonomy, CBAM looks at only direct carbon pricing and not indirect carbon pricing in the exporting countries. But it is true that many exporting countries, particularly in developing countries, they may be, more comfortable in indirect carbon pricing because they may not always be. I'm not talking only about India. They may not always be having enough, wherewithal to come up with a full-fledged cap and trade system or a direct carbon tax. But they may be doing it in their own way in terms of regulatory, measures. But if you can somehow convert the carbon pricing implications of those regulations, then there would be a carbon pricing implication. But that is not covered under EU CBAM because it covers only direct carbon pricing and factors that in among the exporting countries. So there comes this question of interoperability, and similar issues comes up in the context of the taxonomy, and Kaushik talked about that there are different definitions of the green steel. So Kaushik, would you like to add a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think in the interest of time, I think India's green taxonomy of green steel is fine, but I think you see that in order to actually comply with the CBAM kind of stuff, I think I preferred not to use the word green steel because there are as such no legal definitions of green steel. And currently, I think if you're looking at the end users and nobody might even have a clarity on what exactly would, like, for instance, if you look at a simple automobile, a car, it has 116 different parts, with some of which uses green steel and some of which uses, I mean, I would like to call it decarbonized steels. So unless and until there's a clarity in terms of the demand side itself, there would not be a big push in terms of a standard setting in terms of a green steel. So I think we need a lot more of clarity in terms of, so India has come out with its taxonomy of green steel, but that may not necessarily align with what exactly is being prescribed or being mandated by, for instance, EU ETS. But it has tried its best to align itself with what it has talked about. Now, coming to the questions of, I think that's exactly, I mean, I don't want to talk further because I may go on and on. So I'd like to stop at that possibly. And I think interoperability is something of an issue, which I think, because currently, in Indian CCTs, if you look at, they simply look at the emission intensity. And so if you are trying to expect the carbon prices to come out of that of a similar nature, as for instance, EU ETS has prescribed, I would like to say that it will take some 10 more years, for instance, to actually for particular CCTS to mature and live up to that stage, because EU ETS started with grandfathering and moved on to 20 years, as Kasturi has talked about. So it may not be, it would be an unrealistic expectations that way to kind of assume that everything, and Kasturi was talking about the indirect, like for instance, carbon pricing. I would like to say most of the companies have gone ahead with internal carbon pricing. That's one way that they have already done it. So
And I'll put you off soon.
Have this EU ETS action and they actually account for those are the kind of stuffs I think which invariably comes in. I'd like to stop at that.
Thank you. Okay, Constantin, 1 minute, and then we have a final thing, and then closing words. 1 minute, go ahead.
Okay, I'll beat you to that 1 minute. So while I agree with the previous two speakers on the issues of standard setting, I would like to clarify, which I think was how I interpreted the question, is CBAM has nothing to do with standards. Yeah, so it does not operate on standards at all. It only counts emissions. So it doesn't matter that different country for the CBAM, it doesn't matter that different countries have different standards. It has nothing to do with standards. It only counts emissions. So while I agree with the previous speakers that it is a problem in general, it's an entirely different question. Okay, so that's that. Now for the resource shuffling. So as I said, so the CBAM incentivizes decarbonization. And we said that the exporter or the exports are only a small share of the domestic capacity. So China, 1,000 megaton production, only 5 megaton export. And the argument has been made, if they only decarbonize those 5 megatons and keep the rest emission intensive, then that would be resource shuffling. I respectfully disagree, because it's not resource shuffling for the reason that it's not a resource that has yet existed. So it can't possibly have been shuffled. Yeah. So we don't have any green steel. And in one way, it's a bit contradictory, because we say, oh, we want to incentivize decarbonization. And when the country decarbonizes, we say, oh, it's resource shuffling. So it's also a contradictory argument, I find. But we don't have green steel. So if they invest in green steel, that's new. It's not a shuffling of a resource.
You're on mute, Amanda.
Thanks. Speaking while on mute here. So I wanted to, before we close off, give the floor to Francesco from Bologna, because he has some insight into the working group of the Commission. Sorry, there's a very short time for you, Francesca, and putting you on the spot, but would you like to talk just for 1 or 2 minutes about the work there, and maybe reflect on some of the questions that were mentioned earlier?
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for organizing this session. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Francesco, and I work for Bellona, a Brussels-based climate NGO, and we are members of the expert group established by DG Taxud, so the Directorate General dealing with the CBAM. And yeah, maybe just a couple of things that are relevant, and I was about to write in the chat that regarding this last point about the question of relevance with the taxonomy and interoperability and standards, even though I would agree with Constantin that CBAM looks at the emissions, I would like to add an insight that the Commission shared in the last expert group meeting, which is that the Commission is actively looking at different let's say methodologies, so either standards or MRV systems in third countries, to kind of simplify a little bit this issue that you might have, where different countries might have different standards and different definition and different MRV system. And of course, I totally agree that interoperability is very important, of course, if done in a way that ensures that you actually account emissions properly. When it comes to other points, well, one point that we are working on quite often, and I didn't hear it in the presentation, is, for example, the fact that, especially when it comes to steel, currently CBAM does not cover indirect emissions in steel, and this is something that the Commission is again looking at. I mean, should be looking at this, either for the methodology, but also whether to include it for steel or not. So maybe that's also want to know, and yeah, we're working on this issue. So expect something very, very soon from us. But yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you.
mindful of the time. Thank you.
Thank you, and sorry to give you so little time. We would have loved to listen to more, as I'm sure is the case for everything regarding this topic. I want to say the same to all of the speakers, that we should have had 5 hours and not 2.5, but then maybe we couldn't have focused for that whole time. So I want to thank everyone, most of all our fabulous speakers today, and also everyone for posting questions and actively taking part in this session. We have noted all of the questions that came through in the chat, and we will be making an effort to have those answered by the speakers and sent out with the material. So this session has been recorded, and you will also get all of the presentations. There will be a delay in getting some of Constantin's slides because they are copyrighted until the publication of the paper, but you will hear from us over email on that. And also, I am sure that I can speak on behalf of all of the speakers when I say I think they are very happy to be contacted if there are more questions. So you can also reach out to us if you would like their contact details for any specific next discussions. And finally, I'm going to end on the note that I do believe there will be more on this topic because demand is high and there is a lot of interest. And we've also seen demand for a session in a different time zone. So we will contemplate all of this and get back to you with suggestions for what we can all learn together next. With that, thank you all and have a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.